Welcome, everybody, to this session. And I shall in a moment introduce our speaker, but before that, there's always the ritual of asking, does anyone have any announcement to make? And at that point, Mary Claire comes rushing in with an announcement, but not tonight. Anyone else with an announcement? No need to rush in, just raise a hand.
Is there anybody in the room who hasn't signed up for dinner but would like to join us afterwards?
Did I sign up?
You did.
Good.
Anybody else? No? Okay, that makes it easier. Thank you.
Everyone, I now move on to introduce our speaker for the evening, and I want to make a couple of comments in a moment, but the very first thing I'm going to say is we have a new doctor amongst us. Always a moment of pleasure for us all. And Baz has in fact been coming to this seminar quite a bit, but his doctorate was in St Andrews. His theme is diplomacy and public communications in the Anglo-Dutch world in the late 17th and early 18th century, part of the long 18th century that we love. Some of our discussions have gone back to the 16th century, and one on Anglo-Dutch relations, we went right up late 20th century. We're happy with that. And Baz has also published some articles and chapters and books on diplomatic dispatches and their relationship with London publishers. And he works for the International Early Short Title Catalogue. Have I got that in the right order? The
Universal Short Title Catalogue.
Universal Short of works before 1700. So clearly, this is a man who believes in communication and studies communication. And I asked him, just for instance, whether he knew if he had any relationship to the Victorian prude called Bowdler, who used to emasculate all the sexy and naughty bits from Victorian novels. But he said he didn't know. But I wonder whether he's trying to expiate a family guilt for by talking about communications today. However, that is entirely for you to say, Baz, and the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you very much, Penny, for that kind intro, and thank you everyone for coming on. Thank you everyone online for bearing with the problems at the start. So I hope that's the end of it all. Apologies all for the slight change of title. You see, I've kept my sort of very optimistic declaration about the approval I expect to meet with my own inquisitive persons. On the 28th of May, 1695, a paper entitled The Haarlem Courant appeared on the streets of London. The Dutch Gazette, from which it was translated, the tri-weekly Oprecta Haarlemse Courant, or the authentic Haarlem Courant, had established itself as one of the most influential and authoritative papers in late 17th century Europe. As the Haarlem Courant's publisher, one R. Young, proclaimed at the top of the first issue of his paper, a translation of the Haarlem Courant was very acceptable, given that the Dutch paper was so much approved of by all inquisitive persons, and he proposed, therefore, to translate it constantly as soon as it arrives. Young's translation proved short-lived, however, folding after just 2 issues. Yet he was not alone in perceiving an appetite for Dutch news in late 17th century England. Over the previous 16 years, 4 other translations of Dutch newspapers had appeared in England, 3 of them translations of the Oprecta Haarlemse Courant. The translation of Dutch newspapers into English was just one aspect of a vibrant culture of news exchange between the Dutch Republic and England at the turn of the 18th century. In part, this reflected the deep entanglement of Anglo-Dutch affairs in these years, as close religious, commercial, and political bonds were strengthened by dynastic union under William of Orange and military alliance against France in 2 protracted wars. This in turn built on a century of intense Anglo-Dutch cultural, demographic, and political exchange as people, news, and texts travelled back and forth across the North Sea. And over the last decade, historians and literary scholars have paid increasing attention to this phenomenon, considering the ways in which it reflected and actively shaped a transnational Anglo-Dutch public sphere. This work has been underpinned by a shift in the history of early modern news and communication, away from a focus on the development of newspapers in a narrowly national framework towards an appreciation of the continental dimensions and scale of European news culture. By excavating the emergence of continent-spanning postal networks and a common lingua franca in the form of first Latin and then French, historians of news have emphasised that news and text travelled far from their place of origin, creating a common European news community. Yet while Anglo-Dutch public politics and news culture in the context of the British Civil Wars and into the Restoration have received a great deal of attention, Anglo-Dutch relations in the wake of the so-called Glorious Revolution have received practically no sustained attention, despite the extent of Anglo-Dutch alignment and a long-standing recognition of the 1690s as a crucial decade in the development of the English press. This curious oversight, I think, can be explained by two historiographical blind spots. The first is the framework of conflict through which historians have approached Anglo-Dutch affairs in the 17th century. By focusing on surges in xenophobic pamphleteering during the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the use English exiles made of the relatively free Dutch press to intervene in political and religious debates within the British Isles, scholars have implicitly suggested that the vitality of Anglo-Dutch exchange declined even as the two societies became entangled to an unprecedented degree in their histories. Not only does this downplay, I think, the endurance of Anglo-Dutch tension and rivalry into the 18th century, but by focusing on dramatic flashpoints of Anglo-Dutch pamphlet warfare, we risk missing the more quotidian but vital role of Dutch newspapers in supplying English audiences with news of European affairs. Indeed, whilst the transnational nature of 17th century news culture has increasingly been emphasised, histories of 18th century news remain far more nation-centric. In part, this reflects an evidential problem. By taking 1700 as fair terminus, transnational bibliographical projects, such as the USTC, which I work for, make it far harder to comprehend the international dimensions of 18th century newspapers than it is for the 17th and 16th centuries. But it also, I think, reflects the different questions asked by 18th century scholars of news, focusing on the proliferation of newspapers in regions outside of London, the importance of periodicals for Georgian cultural life, and debates about press freedom and parliamentary reporting have prioritised domestic over international news. And where 18th century newspapers have been viewed from a transnational perspective by scholars such as Jeremy Popkin, Simon Burrows, and Robert Darnton, who tended to focus, I think, on the subversive value of newspapers, such as the Gazette de Leiden, for opponents of ancien governments at the end of the 18th century. Consequently, British and European news culture before and after 1700 currently appear radically distinct from each other. So studying Anglo-Dutch news at the turn of the 18th century can therefore shine light not only, I think, on British and Dutch history, but help us to answer broader questions about the nature of early 18th century news culture and diplomacy. Questions such as what role, if any, did European news play in the dramatic expansion of the English periodical press after the final lapse of the Licensing Act in 1695? And how did the transnational nature of news networks affect ongoing efforts to regulate the periodical press in late Stuart England? Part one of this paper will tackle the first of these questions. It will interrogate Young's claim about the universal appeal of Dutch news by considering which context English men and women encountered Dutch news in and why they might have hoped to do so. Part two, managing Dutch news, will then turn to consider how the late Stuart regime attempted to regulate access to Dutch news, both within the British Isles, but also abroad. Where then could English men and women expect to encounter Dutch news, and why might they have hoped to do so? Most straightforwardly, Dutch papers could be found in, and for those with the linguistic skills, read in their original language and form. Copies of Dutch gazettes were routinely included in diplomatic dispatches from The Hague to Whitehall. Archival practices of segregating printed and manuscript material have obscured this practice, but references to enclosed prints hint at the ubiquity with which gazettes were enclosed alongside newspaper manuscript dispatches and expectations that the two would be read in conjunction with each other. Frequently, diplomats referred their masters to printed papers for news of a particular development. And on one occasion, an ambassador has to plead pardon for having no better authority than the enclosed Dutch Gazette. Dutch newspapers were therefore routinely read and valued by the Secretaries of State in Whitehall. The additional copies were transported across the North Sea to benefit a broader category of readers. Between 1706 and 1711, an anonymous clerk compiled a list of the coffee houses and individuals the government was supplying with gazettes, making it possible to trace the distribution of Dutch newspapers across a broader stratum of society. And if we focus on the register of coffee houses over here, what immediately jumps out, I think, first of all, is the importance of the London Gazette and also the Gazette de Londres, which immediately account for about 60% of recorded newspaper copies. But if we focus on the smaller corpus of foreign language newspapers, Dutch papers loom especially large, accounting for 19 of the 25 issues we can see here. Interestingly, this was weighted towards French language publications from the Republic, with only 3 copies of the Opletter Haarlemse Courant set against 9 for the Gazette de Amsterdam. Interestingly as well, though our anonymous clerk records no copies of the Gazette de Rotterdam, they still took the trouble to note the paper, suggesting a market for it elsewhere. And it's important to bear in mind that this list of coffee houses here only represents those receiving their gazettes from the state, a very small fraction of the hundreds of coffee houses in early 18th century London. And how reflective the coffee houses in the sample here are of that sort of broader range of things is a bit uncertain, but it certainly seems plausible that Dutch papers were available more broadly. Given the respective size of the Dutch and French-speaking communities in early 18th century London and the relative paucity of Dutch as opposed to French language skills, it's unsurprising the Dutch language papers recorded here are quite uncommon. It's noteworthy, though, of the 3 coffee houses, which subscribe to the Opletter Haarlemse Courant, the Hanover, the Rainbow, and the Smyrna, none appear to have been in Soho, a known gathering point for the London Dutch community. And the Smyrna referred to here may well be the famous coffee house on Pall Mall, frequented by Jonathan Scott and Joseph Addison, amongst others, leaving us with a tantalising, if quite frustratingly hard to prove, image of some of the great literary talent weights of Augustan London, perusing, or having perhaps read to them, the contents of the leading Dutch papers of the age. Nor, though, were Dutch papers limited to the capital. Of the 60 individual newspaper subscribers recorded in SB 9217, 10 took at least 1 copy of the Dutch paper, and 1 individual, a Mr. Tyrrell, took no less than 5 copies of the Gazette de Amsterdam, suggesting he was involved in circulating gazettes to a broader circle, whilst postmasters across the country occasionally requested copies of Dutch newspapers. Dutch gazettes could therefore be found across England, but they were still few and relatively far between. Engaging with them, moreover, required prerequisite language skills or access to a translator. And while this would have been relatively straightforward for French language titles, it surely limited direct access to Dutch papers to a small, if dedicated, audience. Translations such as those published by Young amplified then the potential audience for Dutch papers and brought them within reach of monolingual English readers. Young was not unique in presenting his translation as a response to an extensive demand for access to the Haarlem Courant among non-Dutch readers. The publisher of a 1681 translation of the Courant declared that nothing could give you a better prospect of things than the Haarlem Gazette, which, having the greatest vogue of all that are foreign, will, without doubt, contribute more to the satisfying everyone's curiosity than all the gazettes that are extant. Heady stuff. The potential of these English translations to satisfy the extensive market that they perceived, however, was curtailed by the short publication life which all of them enjoyed. Young's paper, we've already noted, only lasted 2 issues, and the longest lived of these translations, a 1679 one of the Opletter Haarlemse Courant, endured for only 11 issues. In part, this reflected the difficulty of receiving Dutch post on a reliably regular basis. Adverse weather conditions in the channel could hold up the packet boat between Harwich and Helvoetsluis for days or even weeks at a time, making it impossible to publish translations with the fixed regularity expected of a periodical paper. But the speed with which these translations folded also revealed the hand of state censorship, a matter to which we shall return in part 2. Revealingly, 3 of the 5 Dutch newspapers found translations dated to the years of the exclusion crisis, while another appeared in the unsettled circumstances of February 1689. Moreover, many of those behind translations of Dutch news were prominent Whigs, such as the publisher Benjamin Harris. And as Jason P.C. has argued, the government of Charles II perceived a link between Dutch news and a Whig political agenda. Translating and printing Dutch news could therefore be construed as a subversive act, but the appeal of Dutch news was broader than this and outlived the years of Whig opposition. Young anticipated sufficient demand for his translation of the Haarlem Courant in 1695, and a decade later, in 1706, the Scottish Privy Council gave permission for an enterprising publisher to print translations of the Haarlem Courant as well as the Paris Gazette, though no surviving copies of either venture had come down to us. Translations of Dutch papers cannot always be taken at face value, however. In February 1689, a paper entitled The Haarlem Courant appeared in London, printed by one Daniel Search. A clear nod to the Oprecta Haarlemse Courant, a closer inspection of the contents of the only surviving issue of the Haarlem Courant, and a comparison with the Oprecta Haarlemse Courant issue for the same date, shows not only that very clearly Search's paper contained far less text than the Dutch original, but on a closer look, there's no overlap whatsoever in any of the reports that we found. Embarrassing, really. And nor did Search's translation, if we're going to call it that, bear any relation to recent issues of the Haarlem Courant, which would have been available in London at the time of his publication. How many of Search's readers were taken in by his deceit is unclear, and it introduces a necessary, a bit slightly unwelcome degree of uncertainty into the question of accurate translation across geographic and linguistic borders. It is revealing, though, the regard in which the Haarlem Courant was held. Despite having no access to the Dutch original, Search nevertheless attempted to capitalise on its reputation by publishing a translation of the influential paper. But English readers were most likely to encounter Dutch news not through original copies or translations, genuine or otherwise, of papers such as the Haarlem Courant, but indirectly in the pages of English gazettes. The paragraph-length reports, which formed the basis of early modern news books and gazettes, were routinely and shamelessly recycled between different publications in the form of copy and paste plagiarization, which makes it possible to trace the transmission of news between different gazettes. This practice is especially clear when we look at the contents of England's first daily newspaper, the Daily Courant. When he began publishing the Courant in March 1702, its publisher, Elizabeth Mallet, took the unusual decision of grouping the enclosed reports not by geographic area, as was the standard practice for British and European gazettes across the 17th century, but rather grouping them according to the foreign publications from which she had taken them. Mallet took care to explain her unusual decision in an advertisement which appeared at the bottom of the Courant's early issues, stating her desire to transparently reveal her sources and allow her readers to judge of the credibility and fairness of the relation, rather than hiding behind a pretense of private intelligence. Embarking with a new and highly expensive venture into the increasingly crowded periodical market of early 18th century London, Mallet thus strategically presented herself to the Courant's readers as a trustworthy newsmonger, closely engaged in European sources, capable of furnishing herself with all that comes from abroad in any language. Equally, she imagined her audience as an equally discerning and continentally engaged readership, one sufficiently engaged with foreign newspapers to confidently judge the credibility of different relations based on the publication they had appeared in. It's therefore noteworthy that over the course of the Daily Courant's first decade, Dutch newspapers absolutely dominated its contents. Based on this rather painstakingly assembled, it has to be said, sample of 660 different issues, very fun September for everyone. From the first 5 issues of every month of the first 11 years, we can immediately see that Mallet and her successors were deeply indebted to Dutch publications. 4 of the 5 most cited issues in the Daily Courant across this period were printed in the Dutch Republic, and over 70% of the total number of citations in the sample were taken from Dutch papers. Amsterdam was an especially prominent centre for news, its Dutch and French language papers alone accounting for nearly 40% of the citations in this sample. Over time, we can also trace the waxing and waning influence of different gazettes for the Daily Courant's publishers. Within Amsterdam, for instance, we can see the gradual decline of the Dutch language Amsterdamse Courant towards the French Gazette Amsterdam, even if the relevance of this paper did fluctuate a little bit over time. We can see it peaks in 1704 to 5 and declines a little bit in subsequent years, but nevertheless remains a pretty key source for the paper. Meanwhile, the Poor Old Plector Haarlemse Courant, with which we began, was the second most cited paper in the Daily Courant's first year, but subsequently declined in influence until by the 1710s it stops being cited altogether. Through the pages of the Daily Courant, therefore, English readers could engage with a wide variety of Dutch and French language publications from the Republic. Why did they want to read them? The esteem with which Dutch papers, such as the Haarlem Courant, were held rested on the speed and accuracy with which they were able to comment on affairs from across Europe. The central place of Holland, in particular, in postal and commercial networks, gave gazetteers there ready access to intelligence from across the continent. But from the 1650s onwards, leading Dutch newsmongers began filling their pages with reports directly taken from correspondents further afield. In the 1730s, for instance, the gazetteer Jacob de Jong in The Hague maintained 13 different correspondents from England, France, Italy, and Germany. This was an extraordinarily expensive service, it has to be said, setting de Jong back over 2,400 guilders or £240 a year. Yet it provided him with an extensive and enviable intelligence network. Dutch papers not only had a reputation for providing the most accurate accounts of European affairs, but also, thanks to the proximity of the Netherlands to England, they were often the first and most direct means by which European news travelled over to the British Isles. And unsurprisingly, the Daily Courant cited reports from Dutch papers taken from across Europe. But as well as being an unrivaled source for European news, Dutch gazettes also provided British readers with a detailed window into their own domestic politics. The Dutch press laboured under none of the restrictions on reporting the affairs of the Crown or Parliament under which the English press was subjected. As the editor of the first English translation of the Haarlem Courant put it in 1679, a translation of the Dutch paper, having the best repute of all that are foreign, would satisfy not only those curious about actions abroad, but also the accounts that are given of the occurrences here. And we can clearly see the impact that this had compared to the English press if we compare how Dutch and English papers reported. The Convention of 1689, which was summoned to settle the throne following James II's flight in December 1688. Though a temporary breakdown in state censorship over the winter of 1688-89 saw the emergence of a number of new gazettes in London, by the time the convention met in late January, press controls had been reasserted, and subsequently the English periodical press contained next to no news of substance on the convention's proceedings. When the London Gazette and the Orange Gazette reported at length on the opening of the convention, they took care to remove any hint of division between the assembled peers and former MPs, and subsequently contained no news from within the Palace of Westminster until the joint offer of the Crown to William and Mary was made several weeks later. Other gazettes were similarly silent or bland in their coverage of the convention. On the 29th of January, as the convention began to debate whether or not the throne was indeed vacant, the London Intelligence euphemistically reported that the Lords and Commons had entered upon the grand affair of the nation, optimistically adding they thought they were proceeding with great unanimity, giving readers confident expectation that their affairs would speedily be settled. And subsequently, no hint of the debates within the convention as to whether the throne was in fact vacant and the terms in which to offer it to William and Mary found its way into the contents of the English press. By contrast, the Dutch Couranten covered the course of the convention in much greater detail and with far more candour. 3/4 of the Oplecta Haarlemse Courant's contents on the 1st of February were given over to reporting the opening of the convention, noting that the election of the Commons' Speaker, Henry Powell, had been contested, signalling to Dutch readers from the outset that the course of the convention would be contested. 9 days later, the debate in the Commons as to whether the throne was vacant was reported in the Haarlem Courant in detail, as was the Lords' objection to the Commons' declaration that James had abdicated the throne. This is not to deny that curious Londoners found other ways to learn the convention proceedings with the periodical press, from eavesdropping on the Palace of Westminster, scribal newsletters, and deliberate leaks by the convention's members. Dutch gazettes were just one means of learning about domestic politics, but their importance endured into the early 18th century. When Anglo-Scottish negotiations began in the cockpit at Whitehall to establish the terms of the Act of Union between April and July 1706, the course of their meetings were again closely followed in the Dutch press. In the last week of May alone, 6 different Dutch and French language papers from the Republic contained news of the negotiations, offering precise information on the matters under discussion. By contrast, whilst the opening of the closing of the talks were noted in a range of English papers and plenty of critical commentary on the consequences of the Union was voiced in the English periodical press, a cursory glance through newspapers available through the Burney collection shows that the course of these negotiations went virtually unreported. Dutch gazettes thus remained a valuable, if not unique, means by which curious English men and women could learn of domestic political developments well after the lapse of the Licensing Act in 1695. Well might the first edition of the Evening Post in September 1709 have complained that we read more of our own affairs in the Dutch papers than we do in any of our own. Stuart statesmen were just as concerned as the publisher of the Evening Post about the ease with which their affairs found their way into the Dutch press and the hostile manner in which they were often framed. As early as 1663, the English ambassador to The Hague could complain that the Oplecta Haarlemse Courant always prints all vile news against His Majesty. And in 1681, at the height of the exclusion crisis, the English envoy noted a profusion of impudent and horrid libels regarding English affairs in the Republic. Indeed, concerns about the impacts of Dutch print activity were acutely heightened at points of domestic crisis, such as the rebellions of Monmouth and Argyll against the accession of James II in 1685. Throughout the summer of 1685, the dispatches of the new English ambassador to The Hague, brilliantly named Bevel Skelton, were replete with complaints about printed libels printed in the Republic, espousing the rebels' cause and denouncing James. In June, he reported with concern that Dutch public opinion was being mobilised in support of the rebels, not least through the gazettes. Skelton was not only concerned about the impact that such publicity was having on Dutch public opinion, he was also well aware through his network of spies that emigrant British publishers sympathetic to the rebels were transmitting this material into England through contacts with the London book trade. In October, he learned that the London-based Quaker bookseller, John Churchill, had met with rebels in Amsterdam while staying with the printer Jacob van der Velde, before returning to London, where his brother, Ormsham, was suspected of having printed the only English edition of Monmouth's Declaration. Skelton and the English government were not only concerned that Dutch text might influence opinion in England, but that exiles and dissidents might capitalise on the industry of the Dutch print trade and the Republic's central place in European news networks to reach audiences across Europe. And indeed, Dutch, French and German editions of Monmouth's Declaration were printed, facilitating the text transmission across Northern Europe. A year after Monmouth's rebellion had been defeated, one of James's Secretary of State, the Earl of Middleton, petulantly refused to share a letter with the Dutch ambassador in London on the grounds that he did not wish to expose his own affairs to the gossip of the world, explaining how little secrecy there was in the Netherlands and how quickly everything there became public. Notably, such concerns about Dutch press activity continued after William of Orange's accession into the years of Anglo-Dutch alliance. In April 1690, William Aglionby, the secretary to the English ambassador, reported to Whitehall with complaints about ongoing hostility with the Dutch press, explaining that this reflected the efforts of the French who were continuing to influence the contents of Dutch papers. 14 years later, as the English government attempted to pressure the Dutch into suspending their trade with France, the English ambassador noted with concern a report in the Gazette de Amsterdam, claiming that, despite an official embargo on English trade with France, a French ship from Bordeaux carrying 100 tons of wine had docked in London, bearing passports from Queen Anne. Dutch news thus remains an alternative and potentially subversive source for news of English affairs, challenging attempts to regulate access to sensitive domestic intelligence. This provokes a variety of different strategies by the English state to control access to Dutch news or attempting to influence the contents of Dutch papers. Most obviously, it directed in efforts to control domestic access to Dutch news. As we've already seen, the English state attempted to maintain a monopoly on the supply of Dutch newspapers, and documents such as SP 9217 can, I think, be interpreted as attempts to closely record who did and who did not have access to Dutch news. By contrast, printers responsible for English translations of Dutch gazettes faced the wrath of the state. In the immediate wake of the lapse of the Licensing Act in May 1695, the veteran Whig journalist and printer Benjamin Harris was brought before the Privy Council, where he was intimidated into terminating his new publication entitled The Packet Boat from Holland and Flanders. But efforts to manage Dutch print did not stop at the borders of the Stuart realms. English diplomatic agents in The Hague and Amsterdam were tasked with checking the contents of Dutch gazettes, their reportage of British affairs, and were expected to take action and lobby Dutch magistrates if there was cause for offence. In the process, late Stuart state communication became a transnational project, enlisting diplomatic agents and foreign regimes to monitor and act on subversive printing abroad. This activity manifested itself in a variety of different direct and indirect methods across the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Most directly, English ambassadors complained to Dutch authorities and urged them to censor Dutch printers and journalists. Over the course of James II's reign, English ambassadors and consuls repeatedly complained to the States General and the Prince of Orange in an effort to silence the Dutch press. In April 1688, for instance, English ambassador Ignatius White complained to Gaspar Fargel, the Grand Pensionary of Holland, about talk in the French Gazette of the English Privy Council discussing the prospect of a Catholic successor to the Stuart thrones. Theoretically, White could count on the support of the Dutch state in this endeavour. The regents of the Republic were well aware of their press's potential to give offence to foreign powers, and in 1693, the burgomasters of Amsterdam instructed the new publisher of the Amsterdamse Courant that he was not to print anything in his paper which might offend a foreign power. In reality, though, Dutch officials were often less than diligent in acting on the complaints of English diplomats, especially at moments of Anglo-Dutch tension. When confronted about his failure to act on complaints about the print activity of the Scottish exile Gilbert Burnet, Gaspar Fargel excused his failures on the grounds that he had been, quote, so preoccupied with urgent affairs that he had forgot to send any orders. White was not so easily mugged off, however, and reflected that he found the State of Holland resolved to protect Burnet based on Fargel's response. Dissatisfied with the response of Dutch authorities, English diplomats were not above dealing with offending printers directly. In 1681, the English consul in Amsterdam went directly to Abraham Castelein, the founding publisher of the Oplecta Haarlemse Courant, demanding that he cease printing such lies as he had lately done of His Majesty's affairs in England, and threatened that he would have the States General silence him if he didn't. A chastened Castelein promised never to commit such a fault again, and a year later, the consul relayed that the printer had become one of the kindest relators of our affairs by means of a sharp rebuke that he received some time ago. Such efforts continued into the 18th century. In 1711, a Jacobite tract printed in The Hague came to the attention of the resident ambassador, James Dayrell, who duly complained to the States of Holland. Dissatisfied with their questioning of the printer behind the tract, Dayrell interrogated the man directly, and when his efforts failed to yield new information, the ambassador ominously wrote back to Whitehall that he would extract a more sincere confession one way or another. In March 1687, Ambassador White boasted to Whitehall that he had prevented an array of gazetteers reporting several scandalous and dangerous animadversions, reflections, and libels concerning the king, and indeed such things had stopped since he had arrived in his post. Just 10 days later, however, White complained about the license given to the gazetteers by the magistrates of Amsterdam to criticise King James. And what incensed White all the more was the veneer of goodwill and cooperation behind which the regents of Amsterdam were abetting this subversive activity. English ambassadors in the Republic thus frequently ran up against the limitations in their authority and Dutch magistrates' capacity and even willingness to act on their complaints and enforce censorship laws. Without recourse to the authority of their sovereign state, diplomats thus had to devise new methods of influencing the Dutch press, which should not rely solely on the authority of the state. One way in which this manifested was in combining coercive threats with incentives in order to render Dutch gazetteers more compliant. In May 1690, William Aglionby reported that he had scolded the publisher of the Gazette de Leiden in response to complaints from Whitehall about the licence of the paper. The chastened gazetteer promised to be governed and follow directions, but only if he was granted a monopoly on supplying gazettes to the English post office. Aglionby was prepared to entertain such a scheme, not least because the Leiden gazetteer already freely corresponded with postmasters, and wrote to Whitehall noting that the French government already had such a working relationship in place with an Amsterdam gazetteer. Finch even set about finding a supplier to enact this scheme, but failed to find a supply with sufficient copies to put it into effect. But this incident shows, I think, how far men like Aglionby were prepared to go in order to buy goodwill with Dutch gazetteers, and were prepared to make quite substantial concessions. Aglionby was naturally keen to present the scheme as his own idea, but I think his letter unwittingly betrays that Dutch gazetteers felt able to negotiate with foreign ambassadors and agents from a position of not inconsiderable strength. Interactions and altercations between English diplomats and Dutch gazetteers could thus be, besides mutually advantageous, if contested cooperation, not merely of brute coercion. The Leiden gazetteers promised Aglionby to be governed and follow directions points to another, more positive direct dimension of English efforts to control Dutch news, one which encompassed proactive attempts to disseminate a positive view of their state abroad. As Helmer Helmers has argued, efforts to influence public opinion abroad were an increasingly prominent aspect of 17th century diplomacy. Bevell Skelton may have raged at the hostility with which the Dutch press reported on the affairs of James II and attempted to censor such remarks, but he was also aware of a need to commission and distribute more positive accounts of the Stuart regime through the Dutch press. In the summer of 1685, he wrote to Whitehall expressing his wish that some good pen would set forth among the scandalous lies and expose his illegitimacy, that it might be spread in foreign papers where people are strangers to both. Not content to wait for Whitehall to do this, Skelton published a Dutch language refutation of Monmouth's declaration, and in the wake of the Duke's defeat and execution, a number of pamphlets and engraved images, such as this one here, denouncing Monmouth and celebrating the endurance of the Stuart dynasty, appeared in the Republic. In November, Skelton proudly forwarded a letter from the Leiden gazetteer to Whitehall, indicating how much disposed he is to print nothing but what may be agreeable to His Majesty. English ambassadors thus recognised that the Dutch press could, if handled correctly, be used to reach audiences within the Republic and indeed across Europe. In the process, they became active participants as well as censors in the lively information economy of the Netherlands. Efforts such as Skelton's reflected a growing concern by the English state to actively attempt to influence public opinion within the Republic to exert bottom-up pressure on the Dutch state. The decentralised and widely dispersed nature of state power in the Netherlands and the close proximity between the governing regents and the citizens they presided over facilitated efforts by both domestic and foreign actors to mobilise popular support within the Republic to sway the course of state policy. During the later 1680s, English diplomats found themselves persistently thwarted not only by Dutch magistrates, but also by the inhabitants of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, who on multiple occasions forcibly opposed Skelton's efforts to extradite English rebels. In subsequent decades, however, English ambassadors and statesmen found opportunities to galvanise public opinion to suit their own ends. One such moment arose in the summer of 1705, when a fierce debate broke out between the Duke of Marlborough, who had been appointed for Captain General of the Dutch Army in 1702, and Dutch generals who refused to comply with his wishes to attack French positions. An incensed Marlborough complained to the States General about the refusal of the Dutch generals to follow his orders, in an embittered memorial in which he directly called for greater command. Eager to conceal the rift in Anglo-Dutch high command from the public, the States General opted not to print Marlborough's memorial, as was customary, a decision which enraged the Duke. Their efforts were immediately undercut, however, when the English ambassador, Alexander Stanhope, had Marlborough's memorial printed, exposing the debate to the Dutch public. This was a direct challenge to the authority of the States General, and Stanhope conceded that the States General were not a little angry at me for the letter so hastily, and believed it might have done something to mobilise and antagonise Dutch public opinion. Stanhope had indeed ignited a vituperative public debate in the Republic, capitalising on Marlborough's considerable celebrity to put pressure on the States General to give the Duke greater command. Ultimately, the States General conceded and gave in. How far this reflected Stanhope's public activities, as opposed to threats by the English cabinet to withdraw from the war with France, I think is unclear. It's probably the latter. But the incident nevertheless shows that English diplomats were willing to use the Dutch press in order to mobilise popular Dutch support and exert pressure on the Dutch state to secure their compliance. Yet English diplomats also used the Dutch press to pursue less immediately self-serving objectives. In June 1690, the combined Anglo-Dutch Navy suffered a major defeat in the English Channel off of Beachy Head, and the English squadrons, led by the Earl of Torrington, either failed or were unable to support the Dutch. Fears of French invasion mounted on both sides of the North Sea and in the Dutch Republic, combined with anger at the English for failing to support them. News of the battle was heavily censored in the English press. The London Gazette whittled down Torrington's own account of the battle for the Privy Council from 544 to a mere 144 words, and carefully excised all mention of the defeat and the casualties sustained, leaving the Gazette's readers with the clear impression that they had actually achieved a signal victory. By contrast, when the Amsterdam and Haarlem Couranten came to report on the battle 10 days later, they did so in much greater detail and with much more honesty. The Dutch admiral's account of the engagement for the States General was reprinted in full, making clear the extensive damage the fleet had sustained, whilst according to the Amsterdamse Courant, it was unclear if the English had engaged in the fighting at all. The most explicit condemnation of the English conduct at Beachy Head to be found in the Dutch Gazette, however, came from an unlikely source. A letter written to the English ambassador, Lord Dursley, by the Secretary of State and Earl of Nottingham, Daniel Finch. Finch praised the Dutch for having behaved so bravely that if Lord Torrington had done his duty, we would have achieved a complete victory, and went on to state very categorically that Torrington alone bears the blame for this unfortunate event. In a radical departure from the uses English ambassadors had made of the Dutch press before, Dursley decided to publicise Finch's letter in the Dutch Couranten and as a standalone text, calculating that a display of public contrition was necessary to calm Dutch anger and salvage the alliance. In this regard, the decision to publicise Finch's letter was a remarkable success. The English consul in Rotterdam excitedly wrote to Finch that, whereas before the Dutch anger had been directed at the English, popular fury was now directed at the supporters of the French. He also passed on the compliments of the States General that, had it not been for that letter, they should not have been able to keep the people quiet. And William Aglionby also reported that the Austrian and Spanish ambassadors in The Hague had praised Dursley's decision to take ownership of the defeat as the only plaster for such a sore, which had saved all both here and with the Allies. In the process, however, Dursley had used the Dutch press to publicise a narrative of Beachy Head, which not only conflicted with, but directly contradicted that put out by the English state at home. Finch may have conceded that this was merely the price for assuaging Dutch anger, but more intriguing, I think, is the suggestion that by denouncing Torrington in the Dutch press, Finch was pursuing a more sly and self-serving strategy. Over the subsequent months, Dutch narratives of Beachy Head found their way back into England. In September 1690, a new monthly periodical, The Present State of Europe, a direct translation of a French language publication from The Hague, appeared in print and carried with it an extensive commentary of the defeat at Beachy Head, quoting at length Finch's damning remarks about Torrington's conduct. Pamphlet accounts of the battle exposing Torrington's shameful conduct there continued to appear over the winter of 1690, one of which closed with Finch's condemnation of the English admiral in his letter to Dursley. This significantly coincided with moves in Parliament to impeach Torrington for his conduct at Beachy Head. A trusted naval advisor, Finch had pushed for the Anglo-Dutch fleet to engage with the French, despite Torrington's objections that the French now badly outnumbered the English and Dutch ships in the Channel. Scapegoating the admiral thus served to distract from Finch's own role in the defeat. As Secretary of State for the Southern Department, Finch was not only responsible for publishing the London Gazette, but also for licensing the press. Frustratingly, his correspondence with Dursley has not survived, but it seems to me highly implausible Dursley would have publicised Finch's letter without his authorisation. Read in this way, the communication of Beachy Head offers an intriguing case of English statesmen using the Dutch press as a platform through which to indirectly criticise domestic rivals in ways which could never have been done through official channels back in England. It shows the capacity of using foreign newspapers to reach not only international audiences, but also at the same time a domestic audience, and to pursue radically diverging foreign and domestic strategies. Late in 1711, news broke in The Hague that British negotiators had gone behind the backs of their Dutch and Austrian allies to negotiate peace terms with France. The Dutch press predictably exploded with a deluge of Anglophobic commentary unmatched since the 1680s. Explicit parallels between the policies of the High Anglican Tories under Queen Anne and James II were drawn, suggesting that Stuart Britain was once again in the grip of French plots to establish Catholicism and absolutism, and that the Dutch would have to intervene to salvage the religion and liberties of the realm, just as they had done in 1688. The English ambassador to The Hague, the Earl of Strafford, diligently reported all of this to Whitehall. But he saw little point in issuing a formal complaint when, he said, papers fully as insolent, of which there are but many, were being printed in Britain. At the same time, Dutch statesmen sought to mobilise public support in Britain to oppose the peace terms, not through pamphleteering and using the Dutch press in Amsterdam or Haarlem, but as they might have done a generation before, but rather by turning to Whig papers such as the Flying Post, leaking compromising news to them, and by collaborating with MPs and peers in Parliament. The centre of gravity in Anglo-Dutch public politics, as well as the balance of power, appeared to have firmly shifted away from The Hague towards London. It would be tempting to close here and conclude that with the emergence of a boisterous, bipartisan press in Augustan England, the importance of the Dutch Republic for English news culture had declined. However, I think this would be to ignore the ongoing restraints under which English journalists continue to operate into the 18th century. The ministry of Robert Harley and Oliver St. John quickly succeeded in reasserting control of the English press with the introduction of the Stamp Act in August 1712, and reporting on the proceedings of Parliament remained controversial for decades to come. In this climate, the importance of Dutch news as an alternative source of information endured. But, as I've argued this evening, Dutch papers mattered not only as a subversive source of domestic news. The regularity with which papers such as the Daily Courant cited Dutch gazettes pointed to their importance in informing British understandings of continental news. So I want to close with 3 points. The first is the enduring importance of Dutch gazettes in the development of English news culture after 1688 and the lapse of the Licensing Act in 1695, which not only reflected the role of the Dutch press as a source for alternative and at times hostile narratives of English affairs, but the more quotidian but no less vital role of Dutch gazettes in supplying English readers with continental news. This, I think, has implications for understanding of late Stuart communication more broadly. Successive regimes were well aware of the transnational dimensions of European news culture and realised that efforts to regulate domestic access to news would only be successful if they were backed up with efforts to manage the press abroad. These efforts will not only entail negative campaigns to censor hostile accounts, but also positive attempts to use Dutch gazettes in order to disseminate a favourable account of British affairs abroad. In other words, the Dutch press was not a threat to be stifled, but a useful, if potentially a subversive tool to be managed with care. Recognising the transnational dimensions of news management then, I think, raises new ways of looking at diplomacy. While 18th century diplomacy has been conceptually reimagined in recent years, with well overdue attention paid to its cultural practices and sociable settings, much of this work has remained centred on the world of elites at court. As this paper has shown, however, diplomats also realised the importance of courting public opinion and were prepared to cooperate with printers and journalists in order to do so. Early modern diplomacy was not the exclusive preserve of shadowy elites operating behind closed doors, but rather a public and participatory practice. Thank you very much.